Hello and welcome to a special end of season edition of Tech Talk. Yeah, we're going to be answering all of your questions, your frequently asked questions that you've been sending in all year long. And we've got all of your favourite Tech Talk experts and myself and Craig Scarborough to answer some of those questions. Now, Craig, the questions have been coming thick and fast all year long. And the first one I've got to ask you are Formula One cars manual? Do they have manual gearboxes?
Well, that's a tricky question to answer because you don't have a gear stick and we call them semi-automatic. But in fact, what you'll find is that they are mechanically manual gearboxes. Inside, it's actually more like a motorbike gearbox inside the gearbox itself with the gears and the selector mechanism, and the driver has to manually select each gear. It can't be automated, it can't be done for them. They even have to operate the clutch, albeit only at the start of the race and when they come into pits, manually. So yes, they are manual gearboxes.
By regulation, though, it's quite interesting because the rules state the minimum amount of time it has to be between two gears, because if the gear shift is too quick, it becomes an automatic gearbox by definition. So there's almost artificial delays put in those gear shifts, which is always really clever.
OK. I've done my first question. So, Sam, first question for you. Are F1 cars four-wheel drive?
No, they're not, is the short answer. Formula One cars currently are not four-wheel drive at all. It's banned. They're rear-wheel drive only, so all of the motive power from the V6 hybrid unit goes through the back of the car. However, there have been four-wheel drive cars in the history of the sport. The first of them was the Ferguson P99, and if you've ever read the brilliant book by Innes Ireland, the Scottish racing driver, he gives a brilliant account of driving that car in some non-championship races. I think it raced once the British Grand Prix at Aintree and got disqualified, but only because of some outside assistance on the car. It wasn't hugely competitive. Matra later tried a four-wheel drive car, as did Lotus, and neither of them had huge success. More recently, though, a few teams have tried other forms of four-wheel drive. Williams, famously in March, had four-wheel drive cars with four wheels at the back. So 6 wheels cars, but 4 driven wheels at the back. So that's sort of four-wheel drive. And then more recently, there have been yeah, it's not really, is it? It's not what the question's asking. But there have been some discussions in more recent years about using the hybrid systems on Formula One cars to drive the front wheels of the cars. That first came about in 2009, 2010 with the cost cap regulations when they were first announced. That didn't really come to pass. And then more recently, I think it was first tabled for 2026, but that hasn't happened. But I think maybe at some point in the future, perhaps, Formula One could go four-wheel drive once again. Now, Craig, a lot of the questions we get are quite similar. We see them quite a lot, and this one is one we see all the time. It's been going for years, and I don't think it's to do with low radar cross-sections. But why do some of the cars have little jaggedy windscreens in front of the driver?
Well, the answer to many of these questions will be aero. And what we're talking about here is just in front of the cockpit, they're supposed to put a little plastic screen. And a few years ago, Mercedes innovated by having this little jagged screen. Initially, it was Nico Rosberg. And this is all really about, funnily enough, not just aerodynamics, but mainly driver comfort. So the air comes up over the nose, over the front of the chassis, and by the time it gets to the cockpit entry, it's all turbulent. And for the driver, this means that the helmet can lift or that it can be buffeted around. And they just found by putting these jagged edges into the screen, it just rearranged the airflow, made it much more comfortable. For a while, Rosberg was running the jagged windscreen. Hamilton had a straight windscreen, obviously back in that era. And then Hamilton copied him, and so did virtually everyone else in Formula One. In fact, oddly, since 2022, people have started to go away from needing these windscreens with these current cars, which I think is quite interesting, probably something to do with the fact they're running in slightly cleaner air as well.
In Abu Dhabi, in Free Practice 1, we actually saw one of the Free Practice 1 drivers, the young drivers, complaining about their helmet being lifted off. There's a low-pressure area, aerodynamic low-pressure area around the cockpit, and if you ever drive a single-seater race car or a sports prototype, like a Radical or something, you can sometimes really feel the upforce on a crash helmet. It isn't designed for that sort of car. And so that's what it's sort of trying to combat as well. And it's something that, I don't know, is it just driver preference? We'll probably see.
It's always driver preference. It's my preference to ask you difficult questions. Can F1 cars reverse? Another gearbox question.
Yeah, yes, they can. Formula One cars can reverse, and that's the end of that. Or is it? Actually, no, it's a bit more complicated. By regulation, every F1 car must have a reverse gear. But the thing is, rear visibility in a F1 car isn't particularly wonderful. You sort of got these tiny little mirrors that you can't really look out of very well. And you might see that supermarket car park situation where a driver may hit reverse and not look behind them properly and bump into somebody. Surely the best drivers in the world couldn't do that. There has been some suggestion, though, Craig, over the years that the hybrid systems, the MG UK, could be run backwards like a Scalextric's car, and that would allow the car to reverse using the hybrid motor only. But I don't think that would actually work in reality, would it?
In practice, the problem you have is where the MG UK is attached to the engine. It's got the power to reverse. It's got the power to start the engine as well. But what you would have to do to reverse is to actually stop the engine, use the MG UK to reverse the car by driving the engine in backwards, which means it's working against compression, and then restart the engine, which is a lot for the battery in the MG UK to cope with. So they just keep that little reverse gear in the gearbox, operated from the steering wheel.
Of course, Formula One drivers never want to go in reverse, but one thing that I do think Formula One drivers also want to avoid is remembering half of the alphabet, alphabeti spaghetti in some cases, particularly down at Ferrari, where the drivers sometimes have to remember plans A, B, C, D, Y and Gamma. So the question that I have, and comes through from an awful lot of people online as well, is just how many race strategies does a race strategist come up with before each Grand Prix? Well, the perfect person to answer that question is a race strategist herself. It's Bernie Collins.
It's very variable across, depending on the race, but generally you try and stick to 3. The reason for doing that is you're really limited by what the driver can remember, and you don't want to have it too complicated for either the driver or the pit wall, because it's hard to remember the order that the tyres come in, so whether it's soft, medium or hard, and the stop laps associated with that. We often hear that teams maybe have letters higher than C in the alphabet, but I think that's maybe because they start at different letters or don't use 3 that are just at the beginning, mainly to confuse us all at home. What is everybody doing on the pit wall through the race? Well, there's lots of various jobs on the pit wall. My job obviously was to do strategy on the pit wall, but generally you have a race engineer, 2, 1 for each driver. You'll have a head of race engineering who's trying to make decisions across both cars. You'll have people like the team management, so you might have the CEO of a team or the sporting director who's the person in communication with the FIA. So there's a number of people on the pit wall with a number of different roles. How did you learn to be a race strategist? Well, there's lots of different routes to be in race strategy. I learned because I did a mechanical engineering degree, and then I went on to work within a race team, first of all as a performance engineer. But it's much more normal to start as with a mathematical degree and then join a strategy group in a junior role, probably helping with some of the support that forms the strategy, and then working your way up through that group to become on the pit wall.
Absolutely fascinating stuff there from Bernie. Now, Craig, when you're talking about race strategy, you simply cannot ignore the different tyre compounds, soft, medium and hard. But you see actually different compounds of tyres at different racetracks. What's that all about?
Well, that's because each of the tracks are very different. I mean, if you think about from Monaco to Monza, circuits that either are all about straight line, all about acceleration, or about how much cornering energy they have. And then you've got other factors like the track surface, Barcelona, very abrasive circuit, and then you have different weather conditions from cold, as we saw in Las Vegas, to absolutely baking in Qatar. And all of these factors go together with how the car has to perform around the circuit, and they find that perhaps softer tyres won't work on more aggressive circuits, and equally harder tyres won't work on some of the more easygoing circuits. So Pirelli will do all of their homework to try and guess the best range of tyres to suit that track and to give us some options on strategy for the race.
Actually, Pirelli sometimes deliberately make it a little bit difficult for the teams as well, putting a step in the strategy or going to a circuit knowing the tyre selection isn't exactly right. And that's to generate maybe 2 or even 3 stop race strategies to try and make life a little bit harder for the teams.
So from all 4 corners of the car to the middle of the car, Sam, and how big is the fuel tank and what are we measuring that fuel in?
Yeah, this is an absolutely great question because Formula One doesn't measure the fuel capacity of the car in the same way that you might do when you drive to your local petrol station and fill up in however many litres or gallons of fuel. Actually, F1 measures the capacity, the maximum capacity of fuel in the car in kilos, 110 kilos of fuel. And that doesn't equal 110 litres because the weight of the fuel is different to the weight of water, because depending on the temperature and the fuel you're using. So it's slightly different in that sense. But Formula One also has a fuel flow limit. And this is something a lot of people get muddled up, particularly in the past when we had 100 kilos of fuel and 100 kilogram per hour fuel flow limit. And people didn't really understand the difference between the fuel flow limit and the fuel capacity. So the way to explain that is best with pints of beer, certainly if you're me. Fuel capacity is how many pints of beer you drink. Fuel flow limit is how fast you drink those pints of beer. So if you down your pint of beer, not recommended, that's a very high fuel flow limit. If you sip it like it's a glass of wine,
Like I do.
that's a very low fuel flow limit, or a very, very low fuel flow. So that's the fuel flow limit and the fuel capacity. So they are slightly different. And that's all going to change again in 2026 when we have an energy flow limit, which we'll explain a lot closer because that's all to do with protein bars and spaghetti and baguettes. But Craig, after you've had a nice drink, there's nothing better than laying back in the bathtub and having a relax. But Formula One drivers sit almost horizontally in the car, like they are in the bathtub with their feet on the taps. Why do they sit in that position?
Well, this actually is a really historical question because this goes back many, many years. And back in the old days, the drivers used to sit very upright in the car, in fact, above the prop shaft often, so they were quite high up in the car. And the true answer, as with so many, is aerodynamics, although weight distribution and centre of gravity height is a factor as well. Really, you want the driver to be as low down as possible so the airflow can go over the car, hit that rear wing, give you all the downforce you need for corners. And it got to the point where the Brabham BT55, the driver was laid so low that it kind of reached a point where it was starting to get a bit silly. So there are now regulations that set exactly how far down you can sit in the car. And the shoulder height is about 55 centimetres off the ground. So that's like you trying to lean against your sofa in your front room. And it's actually surprisingly low down. And then there's the other part is you're lying very low down, but then your legs are up in the air. In fact, your feet are some 30 centimetres above the floor of the car. So it is literally, as they say, like sitting in the bath with your feet on the taps. And the reason for this, again, aerodynamics. They want the raised nose to get the airflow under the car to hit that lower leading edge of the floor and do all its good work for aerodynamics. So unfortunately, the drivers are being contorted into some rather odd, but actually when you're in it, surprisingly comfortable positions. It's quite embryonic sitting in a race car like that. And that's really the main reasons. Not perfect for their physiology, but perfect for the aerodynamicists.
Well, we've just had an absolutely wonderful example there of visualising that F1 technology, that F1 layout, and a man who might actually get a real bathtub and sit in it in the paddock to demonstrate that seating position is Albert Fabregat. And who better to answer some more of your questions than the Spanish maestro himself?
Why do F1 cars spark? Good question. And to know the answer, we have to go under an F1 car. As you see, they have a plank that goes all along the car. It's a plank, it's not a wood. It looks wood, but it's not. It's a resin material. It has a thickness of 10 millimeters, and they can have a wear of 1 millimeter. So FIA has 4 control points. It's a hole of 50 millimeters where they can control if the thickness is within the regulations. These control points are surrounded and protected by a metal piece, like this one, that protects the hole for the FIA to measure at the end of the race or the end of a qualifying. And this is metallic. It's a titanium alloy that goes on this area, and the back one. When this part touches the floor, it creates the sparks. This is why the sparks are created. This is touching the floor. Why I pursued a career in Formula One? Good question. I don't know the answer, to be honest, because there's no one in my family that is dedicated to motorsport. But yeah, I would say that I was in love with Formula One once I was a kid, and I watched a Monaco race, a Formula One, where Ayrton Senna was showing his capabilities, and from that point I said, I want to be part of the Formula One. I wanted to be a driver, to be honest, but I couldn't, so I started working in different motorsport categories till I reached my dream, that is to be here in Formula One as mechanic, and then in different other jobs. But at the end, I end up like doing commentators and being still in love with Formula One. That is not a job; it's a way of life. So I hope that it will continue for a long time.
Absolutely fascinating there from Albert. You never do quite know what he's going to come up with, do you? Well, something else that people don't know and do want to know the answer to is right back at the beginning of every race. How long is it between the 5 lights coming on and the race getting underway, Craig?
Well, the simple answer to that is, I don't know. You don't know, no one knows, because the difference between when the lights go on and go out is a randomised point. So what happens is all the cars will line up on the grid and their positions will be logged, and as we see when the last car is lined up, someone waves the green flag at the back of the grid, and that then means the person starting the race initiates the start sequence where you see the lights go on, and then when they go out is a random time, up to about 5 seconds. And it's one of these things that's always kept very secret. Now, this 5-light system has actually been in Formula One for far longer than I actually recalled. The last time we had a red and a green light was Adelaide 95, at the end of the season. When we came to Melbourne, still in Australia, for the start of the season in 96, we'd gone to this 5-light system. And by and large, it's been a big success because there's no human interaction. There's no way that you can predict it. Some teams played about with some clever ways of doing this by reading the signals from under the circuit, but that got found out, and that has now been rectified, and the teams can't cheat in that way anymore.
I saw a great interview of Jackie Stewart once where he was talking about the old famous race starter Toto Roche, and when he was getting a bit older, the guy would lift the flag and all the drivers would leave the grid and start the race as soon as he lifted the flag. And Jackie Stewart also used to make great starts because he'd worked out, because Toto Roche was getting quite old, his knees were going a little bit, and he moved with his knees a little bit before he went for the flag, and so he knew that was the point the race would start, and he'd never got caught jumping the start. And then after the 5 lights were introduced, there was still a period where it was a human who decided how long the race would start for. On very hot days, Charlie Whiting, who was the race official back then, would keep his finger on the button for however long he thought. But when it was very hot and the cars were struggling, the lights would always go out quite quickly. And I think the drivers started to learn that as well. And it was always a slightly interesting situation at the race start to see what would really happen.
OK. Right then, over to you again now, Sam. And why is it Formula One?
Well, this is a weird question, and it goes back to the 1940s and possibly even to the 1930s. I haven't quite gone back and checked the history books that far back yet. But formula, it's nothing really to do with mathematics, but then again, it sort of is. It's the formulation of the technical regulations. And some French people and some English people debated about what to call this new category of racing that they'd invented in 1946, and they decided to call it Formula International, which then some people called Formula A, and then rebranded it a little bit later, in I think about 1947, 1948, into Formula One, and then the World Championship. Well, somebody who knows all about different attitudes of racing cars and the vehicle dynamics of a car is Tina Gage. She's worked all over motor racing. But one question that we all get absolutely all of the time is, can a Formula One car really drive upside down in a tunnel? Tina.
The answer to that question is quite simply, yes it can. Another reason for that is because when we talk about downforce, what we actually mean is the force pushing the car into the road, but it's the force generated by the floor and by the wings of the car. And that pushes it down onto the road. Now, regardless of which way up the car would be, if you turn it upside down, it's just an aeroplane. If there is a road the other side to react with forces, that will react with the force of the car. Now, in the high downforce specifications, current Formula One cars produce about 5 times their own weight, which means there's 5 times the force of themselves pushing them into the road. That means they will absolutely be able to drive upside down. The biggest problem with driving a Formula One car upside down is getting there. The bit that's important is getting the car flat on the road. What that means is that we need some surface that starts very, very much flat relative to the width of the Formula One car for it to drive round and arrive upside down. That means if we needed a tunnel for it to drive through, for it to drive up the walls and onto the roof of the tunnel, it would actually have to be a huge diameter. And that's the biggest problem with getting a Formula One car to drive upside down. How similar to a road-going hybrid is a Formula One power unit? The answer is quite similar and not really that similar at all. It's obviously very, very complicated. The part that is similar is actually what's called the MGUK side of it, which is basically where we're taking energy from the braking system, so the energy to stop the car, instead of losing that as heat in the brake discs as you would in your car, we're using that to charge a battery, and then that battery is once again delivered back to the wheels as power. The bit that's different is the MGUH. Now the MGUH is it's a turbocharger basically. Generally it's split into two on a Formula One car, and you'll recall this if you go back and watch the tech talks we did on the hybrid system. And that allows either for the hybrid system to charge the battery or to deliver the energy from the turbo back to the road. That's the part that's generally not in your road car. So the answer to that question is both yes and no. It's the MGUK side of it that's very similar to your road car. So how did I get to become a Formula One engineer? Well, it all started when I was very young. I remember being 2 or 3 years old and my parents had this red Datsun, and I absolutely loved it. Any opportunity to go in the car, to have a look under the bonnet, to see what was going on with it, I was there. Loved that thing. And then as I got a little bit older, I became interested in how things work. So I'd take things apart around the house and put them back together again. They didn't always work when they went back together, but that's all part and parcel of learning. That's how you learn. Then at about 8 or 9 years old, I started watching Formula One on television, and that was it. It brought together all of those things, how things work, cars in one, and you could go racing, and I absolutely loved it. That was really the point. Well, I decided I wanted to be a race driver, but I've realised I was probably going to be an engineer. I started out with doing a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, and then went on to do a master's degree in aeronautics, because I actually wanted to be an aerodynamicist. But it's actually in vehicle dynamics where I found my calling, and that's what I'm doing today.
It's always good to hear how somebody got a start in the sport, and Formula Student always playing parts of that for different people as well. Right, this is a question that's come in, and I'm a bit mystified by this one, Craig, and it's coming from a viewer. They're asking, why does Nico Hülkenberg sometimes have black marks on his overalls after a race and his teammate doesn't? I have to say I haven't noticed this.
It's actually, you probably have noticed it on lots of other drivers. So Nico Hülkenberg has got some dirty marks on the back of his overalls. When you look at Kevin Magnussen who gets out of his car, he doesn't. It's quite a simple one. It's down to what padding and lining they have in their seats. Now, we know that the seats are custom moulded to each driver, that they're made from carbon fibre, but then the drivers will have tape and foam and padding all put into their seat just to make sure they've got that last little bit of comfort and security in their seat. Nico Hülkenberg obviously has something that leaves marks on his overalls, and Kevin doesn't. Interestingly, we saw a picture of Lewis Hamilton's cockpit in his seat. He actually had skateboard grip tape underneath the thighs on his seat. So he's actually got sandpaper holding him in to the car. Right, question for you now then, Sam. And this is perhaps not my favourite question, but in terms of a frequently asked question, this is the most frequently asked question in Formula One to Tech Talk. Why do Williams still have the little McLaren Dash on the chassis and not on their steering wheel?
And this is a question that you and I have had so many times, Craig, and we have discussed it on this show before, but let's do it again together, because we've both spoken to the team and we've both had slightly different answers. Some people say cost, some people say it's the inertia of the weight in the steering wheel. When Paddy Lowe was at Williams, he arrived from Mercedes, who didn't do that. He saw it on Williams and said, that's a bit odd, why is it like this? And essentially, the team just said, the drivers sort of like it like that. And when you turn the steering wheel, your driver's head you can't read the dash if it's like that. You don't drive the car like that. If you drive the car like that, it's just there in the same position the whole time, which to me makes sense. When I drive my road car, it doesn't have the speedo going like that as I go around a corner.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the initial reason was the inertia, and they did some tests to see how much effort the driver had to put in and how much the power steering had to draw from the hydraulic system to support quick steering. But then, once you have that, why change? Other than to keep fans happy, because so many fans seem incredibly unhappy that it's like that. But why mould a new thing? As you say, in corners, you're not looking at the dash, you're looking at where you're going, just as we do, hopefully, in our road cars. So no reason to change, and will probably continue for several years.
And it seems some things just really are down to driver preference. And that's one of the wonderful things about motor racing and the engineering of Formula One, is it's also different all of the time. And that means that when you get your questions in, and we do love to get those questions in all through the season, we do read them all and we do try to answer as many as possible. So please, please do keep them coming, because we are really going to be on our feet as another great year of Formula One is in prospect, as the 2024 season is upon us.